He's loving it. It's another hot deal from McDonald's. The latest from our daily newsletter at podnews.net. A former McDonald's drive-thru worker has signed a multi-year, multi-million-dollar podcast deal with his former employer. Gary Koichi, the CEO of Pod Digital Media, has partnered with McDonald's USA to help them reach multicultural audiences. The free and open-source podcast solution for you to self-host, Castapod, has reached version 1.0 and now has a website of its own, we can exclusively reveal. The podcast platform includes open comments, video clips, anonymized analytics, and wide support for the new podcast namespace. It's available for download today. Are you a podcaster? The Podcast Host is running a survey to learn what matters to you. You'll find it linked from our show notes and our newsletter today. The host of the Ambies will be announced a little later today. We predict it'll be hosted by two people. No idea how we know that. Osher Gunsberg and Michelle Laurie have renewed their partnerships with Acast. Michelle's Australian True Crime recently celebrated over 50 million downloads. Osher's Better Than Yesterday has seen a 73% increase in downloads since partnering with Acast. In Sweden, Acast has revealed the winner of the country's biggest podcast competition. Axel Hitanen Ingman, a 26-year-old social worker and hobby musician, will get his podcast produced and marketed. Pod Save America and Love It or Leave It have both announced dates for national tours. And our free jobs board, podjobs.net, now lets you remove vacancies from view if you fill them early and shows statistics like page views and clicks as a percentage of everything. It's a Monday, so time for some tech stuff. Castapod has joined Spotify, Podchaser and Podnews in adding copious amounts of JSON LD to podcast pages. Our schema includes RSS feed addresses, descriptions and the podcast GUID. Might be useful in the future. Now here's a neat thing, a podcast putting their boost messages onto their website. If you have an Umbrel running helipad, then we link to a JSON feed that might help in our show notes and our newsletter today. The launch of Libsyn 5 last week also means a new, more private RSS feed address for shows. Libsyn had used unique domain names for RSS feeds, which are never encrypted and bad for privacy. New feeds from Libsyn will come from feeds.libsyn.com, which is a good thing. Older feeds don't yet 301 redirect, but we assume they will. And if that's all tech speak and you host with Libsyn, don't worry, you've got nothing to do. And Buzzsprout lost 28 podcasts from its platform last week, but Anchor also lost 28 shows, according to our sample of podcasts. Anchor podcasts were, and maybe are still, being produced in a non-compliant format, which makes them unplayable in some podcast apps. And in podcast news, in the PodMotion podcast this week, our editor, that's me, talks about podcast predictions for 2022 and whether subscription is going to become a thing. And today is the 1,500th edition of Cyberwire Daily. It's a cybersecurity podcast hosted by Dave Bittner and the flagship of the Cyberwire network that now includes 14 podcasts and reaches over 250,000 unique listeners every month. And that's the latest from our daily newsletter. For all the links, we're at podnews.net.